my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable unto you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. In our Old Testament readings, we now have left the book of Genesis and are in the book of Exodus, the second book of what are called the 5 books of Moses, what our Jewish cousins would call the Torah, and for us are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And the first line of our reading today sort of has a lot of backstory that we haven't read or that we didn't really talk about last time. So I want to sort of catch us up on the story. Who is this Moses? And how does he come to be tending sheep for his father-in-law, a priest of Midian? I thought we were following the story of the descendants of Abraham and Abraham's God. Who's this Midian? Well, you'll recall last week we read about how, well, a couple weeks ago, we read about how Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, had become great in Pharaoh's household and saved his family from famine by having all of his brothers and their various wives and retainers come and live in Egypt. Now it is some generations later, and those descendants of Jacob have become numerous, but the Pharaoh now does not remember Joseph, and the descendants of Jacob, the Israelites, after Jacob's other name Israel, are no longer honored guests in Egypt. They have become basically slaves in Egypt and are pressed into hard service of building towns and building pyramids, probably. And Pharaoh is concerned about these numerous and oppressed people, that if an enemy of Egypt comes and makes war against him, then they might side with the invader instead of with Pharaoh. And he orders the midwives of the Hebrew people to kill these sons, kill the boy babies. But the midwives disobey him, and they lie and say, well, the Hebrew women are so strong, they give birth before we get there. Then one woman bears a boy child. She hides him for 3 months. And then when she can no longer hide him because he's getting too big, she makes a basket of reeds and sets it floating down the Nile. And her older daughter hides and watches what happens. And Pharaoh's daughter comes with her ladies to bathe in the river and sees this baby, and she says, oh, this must be one of the babies of the Hebrew people. And the daughter comes out and says, would you like me to find you a nursemaid for this baby? And she says, yes, and Moses' mother then is hired to be Moses' nursemaid by Pharaoh's daughter, who has adopted this baby. So Moses grows up as a prince of Egypt in Pharaoh's household, but with a connection to his own people through his mother. And then Moses is a young man, and he comes across someone abusing one of the Hebrew laborers, and he kills him. He becomes a murderer. But he thinks no one sees him. But then it turns out someone did see him, and so he flees. He flees from fear of Pharaoh's anger. And he goes to another country. You know, we have all kinds of online dating apps. You know, if you're single and you want to find a spouse, you now can go on online dating apps. The ancient Israelites didn't have dating apps, but what they had were wells and animals. Because once again, we have a story of someone watering domestic animals, and this is how they find their spouse. In this case, the daughter of this priest of Midian is tending sheep for her father. And she goes to a well, but some shepherds accost her and chase her away. And Moses comes and is at the well, resting and refreshing himself, and he chases away the shepherds for her, and then he waters her sheep for her. And she goes home and her father says, "Oh, your daughter, you're home early." She says, "Well, this young man helped me water the sheep." So they get married. And Moses now is keeping sheep for his father-in-law. I wonder if Moses ever reflected on sort of how he had fallen in life from being a prince in the household of Pharaoh with servants and fine clothes to now being out in the wilderness with a flock of stupid, dirty sheep. We sort of skip to the high points. But Moses didn't know that God was going to speak to him. He was out putting one foot in front of the other, doing in all weathers, taking care of the sheep, helping them lamb, shearing probably. It was hard work. And he probably didn't know a whole lot about the God of his ancestors. We sort of leave out things like sheep and wilderness when we're reading the Gospels or the scriptures. We sort of skip from one sort of bit about God to another bit about God. But life isn't actually like that, is it? You know, if you want the epiphany of being in the Sierra Madres at sunrise, you have to do the hard work of walking there with a pack on your back. If you want the sort of connection to nature that we hope our project out on the land will provide, you know, there were half a dozen young adults out there last week with pickaxes and shovels. Yes, they had machines for making the paths, but areas, they can't use the machines because there's pipes underground. And they were laboring with pickaxes and shovels. College graduates, these kids are. But they're doing this hard work because they care about the environment, because they want people to plant native plants for the birds and the bees and the quail and the deer. It takes work to have those moments of epiphany. And Moses was rewarded out there in the wilderness on the mountain by an extraordinary encounter with God. An encounter with God that reshaped the life of generations, centuries, of God appearing, speaking out of a burning bush and saying, I am. This little construction of I am is sort of grammatically unique, and it contains not just a static being, but also the becoming. I am, I will be. How does a word encapsulate the God of creation who encompasses and gives life to all that is? Not just Moses and his family, not just us and our families, but the beetles, the bumblebees, the spiders, the lizards, the osprey, the oak trees and the willow trees. All life that is supported and shaped by God. This month, we're going to be focusing in our worship for some of those bits that we don't normally talk about. We're going to be looking in the scriptures for the sheep. We're going to be looking for the wells and the springs. We're going to be celebrating the God who is the source of life, not only for people, but also for the quail and the deer and the ospreys. To a great extent, our church is a church of the Reformation. From a time when people still didn't need to be reminded of sheep because they were surrounded by sheep. They didn't need to be reminded of the labor of traveling from one place to another by putting one foot in front of another, because that was how they got around. They didn't need to be reminded of the interdependence of humans and other animals, because horses were their daily companions of how they did their work. Even when our little church was being established in the mid-19th century, you know, when they scraped the topsoil off for the labyrinth, you know what they found? They found a big horseshoe. And I think it's a horseshoe from a draft horse. I think it's from when this land was farmed, with horses, because it's a lot bigger than the shoes of the horses that I ride, and it's a lot older. If you live every day in dependence on horses, if you live every day in company with flocks of sheep and maybe sheepdogs, you don't need to come to church to be told about these things. And so you can have a church service that is focused just on that relationship between God and people. But we don't live in that world. We live in what scientists now are calling the Anthropocene. That's sometimes starting in about the 1950s. Humans have made such an impact on the earth that it is a new geologic age that can be found in the depths of the lakes. I remember when an adult woman who was doing work for us in our house learned for the first time where eggs came from. They come out of the butts of chickens, and we eat them? Well, yes, that's how eggs are formed. We, to be connected with God, don't need to put a backpack on our backs and hike the Pacific Crest Trail like Cheryl Strayed did. And it's a good thing, because I don't think I could do that. But we do need to be reminded of that we are creatures of the land, no less than the flocks of sheep. That life depends on human labor and on the lives of other creatures now just as much as it did in Moses' time. And that some of our work, some of our God-given work, has to do with the rectification of our relationships with other creatures and with the land. That if we think that God's work is only about us and about how we pray, I think we're being as blind as Moses was in Pharaoh's household when he took for granted the labor of the servants, when he didn't know the work that went into the sheep that created the wool, that made the clothes that he wore. Moses made a journey of reconnecting with the land and reconnecting with the God of his ancestors. And it took work, and it took listening. And may we also make a journey of reconnecting to the land that we live on, to the animals that surround us and that support life, to the God who creates and sustains all things.